Welcome to But This Time It's Different, where we unpack chaos in the markets, tech, geopolitics, pretty much anything that we feel like, but always with an eyebrow raised. I am Sinead, a defense economist, investor, and today we are armchair war planners.
And I'm Alex, a finance and technology writer and, well, apparently war enthusiast.
So the question we're asking today is, what happens when two nuclear powers inch towards open conflict and neither of them owns their own war machine? Okay, so the flashpoint. 2 weeks ago, if you haven't already heard this, you're living under a rock. An attack in Kashmir left 26 tourists dead. India blames Lashkar-e-Taiba, a Pakistan-based militant group. The response has been swift and sharp.
India moved to suspend visa access. It ripped up water sharing treaties under the Indus Waters Treaty and began freezing trade channels. Pakistan then fired back with trade suspensions, threats of diplomatic downgrades, and a full-blown nationalist media campaign.
Yeah, so going back to the water thing, it is essentially the core of how India and Pakistan coexist. You start with weaponizing water, you're in economic pressure, you're actually in existential threat territory. Like the water thing is a big deal here.
Yeah, and neither side is really in a position to de-escalate. You have hyper-nationalist populations, you have nuclear weapons on the table, and you have two countries' leaderships who are under pressure to look strong. Modi obviously secured a third term, but not with the majority that was really widely anticipated everywhere. Meanwhile, if you look at Pakistan, Sharif's coalition is fragile and is still reliant on the country's military shadow power structure to keep things from collapsing. And Sinead, the Pakistani economy has not been looking good for a while, has it?
Yeah, so economically, Pakistan does actually face significant challenges, okay? And we actually touched on this in a previous episode. The country recently secured a $7 billion bailout from the IMF, which is never going to signal strong economic confidence. But the conditions actually triggered total austerity measures, so tax hikes, energy price shocks, that are actually now fueling widespread public discontent. Inflation, high. Growth, sluggish. Foreign reserves are dangerously low. To stay afloat, as we've already discussed previously, Islamabad just renewed a major currency swap agreement with China. So essentially a lifeline to stabilize the rupee and settle imports without burning through its US dollar reserves, which it has very low of. It's a financial backstop, but also a massive signal. Pakistan is leaning harder into Beijing's orbit, economically and diplomatically. Again, we talked about this the last time.
Yeah, and to complicate Pakistan's woes, India does field one of the world's largest militaries, and we're talking 1.4 million active duty troops, almost the same number in reserves, the world's fourth largest defense budget after US, China, and Russia. A big army, big air force, serious modernization program underway. And the country has also been on a hardware acquisition spree for a while. So historically, India's military was heavily dependent on Russian equipment as a kind of legacy of the ties the country built during the Cold War. But as well as continuing to buy air defense systems from Russia, we've seen them load up on drones from Israel, US maritime surveillance platforms, and France's highly capable Rafale fighter jets. So they're beginning to hedge in every direction, and that combination of systems looks quite scary.
Yeah. And then you have Pakistan, smaller, much, much smaller. So only around 650,000 active troops, 500,000 in reserves, $11 billion defense budget versus $75 billion for India. It's 1/7 of the size of India's army. But Pakistan never played the numbers game, okay? So here's where it gets really interesting, because the entire strategy that Pakistan tends to follow is based and predicated on asymmetric warfare. They're not built to be the biggest in the world, but they are built to be one of the most disruptive, fast, and early escalators, okay? They know they can't match India, tank for tank or jet for jet, but instead they actually focus on things where they do actually punch above their weight. The biggest one being tactical nukes. So it's not about long campaigns. It really is about making the cost of conventional war so high, so quickly for India, that India backs off before it can even really start a conventional war.
And when it comes to nuclear doctrine, I think the big difference is what's known as the kind of the two countries' respective first use policy. So India sticks to a formal no first use policy. It means that the country won't ever initiate a nuclear exchange. But Sinead, Pakistan doesn't play by that rule book, does it?
No, and this is where the competition between India and Pakistan gets truly frightening, okay? Because unlike India, Pakistan's nuclear doctrine is deliberately ambiguous. They do not have this no first use policy. In fact, they have what is referred to as calculated opacity, which means that they reserve the right to use tactical nuclear weapons early in a conflict if they believe Indian forces are going to break through their defenses or escalate before they get a chance to respond appropriately.
Yeah, so we see this in Pakistan's nuclear missile system, and it has these short-range battlefield nukes, like the NASA missile system, which are specifically designed to deter India. And if India crosses a red line, conventionally, Pakistan might escalate this nuclear level first to sort of shock the system and force a ceasefire. The danger isn't necessarily mutually assured destruction so much as mutually assured panic. The more successfully India fights and the closer it gets to a battlefield win, the more it risks triggering a nuclear response.
Right. And so the victory of India itself becomes India's danger to itself. I mean, we need Nassim Taleb here to talk to us about fragile and anti-fragile systems.
Yeah, I think he spends most of his day like beefing with people on Twitter these days. Or my favorite tweet of his was critiquing members of the Taliban's gym technique. It was one of the more surreal moments of late 2021. Yes, this putting aside no first use policies and mutually assured panic, it gets even worse because we have all this planning, we have all this saber rattling, but do we even know if this machinery of war will actually work when they need it to?
Right. So let's think about supply chains, because this was actually one of the more interesting aspects of those moments when Russia entered Ukraine. And now all of a sudden, we're actually using components and military hardware that haven't been used in years. Okay. So let's look at supply chains. Let's look at India. India imports over 60% of its major defense systems. So as Alex, you said, it imports jets from France. They just ordered new Rafale jets, the radars from Israel, tanks and air defense systems from Russia, drone surveillance tech from the US. Okay, so this is not a fully indigenized arsenal. It's quite literally a geopolitical shit show.
Yeah, and each one comes with its fine print. Even if you go back to the start of the 20th century, for each person with a gun who was out fighting, there might have been like, 2, 3, 4 people working in logistics behind them. That ratio in a lot of modern militaries is now something more akin to 10 to 1, which is known as the tooth to tail ratio. And it becomes particularly complicated when in your tail you are depending on technicians, encrypted diagnostics, software updates, and proprietary maintenance protocols that are all controlled by companies that sit outside your jurisdiction. So it stops being about hardware and becomes about political access, supply cadence, and turnaround time.
Well, turnaround time for any of these large companies we know is not good anyway, although slightly faster than governments. But these access points are actually starting to fracture. All right, we don't need to imagine that this might fracture if India and Pakistan went to war. We're already seeing it. Okay, since Ukraine, Russia's ability to deliver even basic spares has collapsed. And as it happens, India operates over 1,000 Russia origin T-90 and T-72 tanks. India has already reported delays in tank parts, artillery barrels, engine components, all of them being rerouted to Moscow's war.
Yeah, and the Heron drones from Israel that India uses and its sort of loitering munitions that also come from Israel rely on proprietary ground control stations, cloud-linked targeting systems, and a whole host of other kind of components and expert advisors. And if Tel Aviv gets politically jittery or, to be honest, gets distracted because, Israel is currently beefing with all of its neighbors simultaneously, seemingly, which is actually not something its military was designed to do for an extended period of time. You can understand why India might become nervous about access to its ISR backbone.
Yeah, absolutely. Israel is busy. Meanwhile, the US has supplied India with its kind of MQ-9, the Sea Guardians. Okay, It's P-8 maritime patrol aircraft. And then you have these GE fighter engines. Each of those systems comes with layered export controls. And I think at the minute, the export control paperwork is coming in anywhere with the earliest time being 45 days up to 250 days. Okay, so one drone camera fails, and now you're waiting for anything between 4 to 5 weeks and over a year in ITAR paperwork delays just to get a parts replacement, because it has to go through agencies in the US that are being disbanded because of Doge.
Yeah, so on paper, this sort of notion of, buying from different countries might look like diversification and it might sound smart, but in practice, it's just a bit of a mess and just increases the number of political dependencies that you have to navigate. So we've seen India seemingly buying from anyone with, a tank or a plane to sell. Has Pakistan been taking the same approach?
Well, Alex, I'm glad you asked, and the answer is no, absolutely not. They have gone all in on China, which is fascinating. So nearly 70% of its new systems that it's in the process of creating and assembling, drones, missiles, kind of electronic warfare platforms, they are Chinese built or actually really interesting co-produced between Pakistan and China. I have a friend in Pakistan at the minute who showed me a video of some military aircraft the other day, and it was the K-8s. These are the trainer Air Force jets the pilots use that were built between Pakistan and China. Very few countries have built their own fighter jets. Pakistan is one such country, which actually very few people know about. Okay, so co-producing and building with China. That includes the HQ-9 air defense system, the Wing Loon 2 strike drone, and most prominently, the JF-17, the Thunder, your kind of typical multi-role fighter jet.
But there's the problem. So Pakistan has 150 of these in service, while on the one hand it's been developed domestically. Not all the parts were made domestically. So the radar's Chinese, the engine's Russian, the avionics are proprietary. And so to kind of fix and maintain these things, you need parts to come from Chengdu or even Moscow. And as you alluded to before, that pipeline is not built for wartime surges, especially at the moment.
And this is one of the most fascinating parts. The modern military systems that we have at the moment were designed and manufactured as we see them today during relative peace times, when nobody imagined that we'd actually be using them. So none of the supply chains are built for wartime surges. So in 2023, Pakistan actually had to ground some of its JF-17 fleet due to parts shortages and this kind of radar problem that it had before any discussion around an India war started. So imagine what would happen if there was actually a need to use these military aircraft.
So yeah, if we imagine a shooting war breaks out, I mean, you can imagine why, for example, French maintenance crews might feel slightly uncomfortable supporting Pakistan as it fights India. And even China, which is far from a friend of India, is highly pragmatic, and it might not want to burn diplomatic capital on a South Asian war that it didn't start. So this could really leave Islamabad sort of mid-conflict, waiting on deliveries that just don't ever sort of show up. And kind of moving away from these like advanced systems, even if we talk about like one of the basics like ammunition, like the same problem recurs, doesn't it?
Yeah, ammunition is undoubtedly one of the biggest problems in defense military supply chains at the minute. And honestly, the one thing probably nearly everyone is shitting themselves about in the Pentagon and in other military strategy rooms. Okay, so India maintains over 4,000 artillery pieces, which is a massive number, including 155 millimeter Bofors and the newer Danush systems. Again, this is for ammunition. Pakistan fields around 2,500 with a mix of US, Chinese, and then domestically modified guns. But here's the problem. All of these big systems are only as effective as their ammunition. And modern conflict, as we're now seeing in Ukraine, is burning through shells like fuel. So Ukraine is firing roughly 6,000 artillery rounds per day. Russia is much closer to 10,000. We are now reverse engineering global supply chains to try to figure out how far up Schitt's Creek are we? And the answer is yes, very. Okay. So at this rate, India or Pakistan could burn through months of their peacetime stockpiles that they've accumulated over years in days.
Yeah, and global production just can't keep up. So, I mean, if you look at Europe, where we're both based most of the time, there are 2 to 3 year delays in basic ammunition and shell orders. The UK has estimated that if it was in a Ukraine-style conflict, it would run out of ammunition in 10 days. So this is why the US is racing to hit sort of 100,000, millimeter artillery rounds per month by late 2025. Breaks down to about 3,300 a day, which again is not enough to sustain Ukraine's current rate of fire, let alone supply 2 new belligerents in South Asia.
Right. And I mean, this gets even more complicated. And we're really diving into the economics and supply chains of ammunition here. But it's just not about the quantity of shells. It's so much more than that. You need brass for the casings. You need nitrocellulose for the propellants, tungsten for the penetrators. What looks like a tiny piece of ammunition is incredibly complex with material and engineering supply chains that go across the world, but also into geopolitically tense areas. So most of these are manufactured not just in the US, but also in Europe and East Asia. Okay. The bottleneck is the propellant. Absolutely. The nitrocellulose for this ammunition and the 150 millimeter shells, okay, is only produced at a single site in America, in Rutherford, Tennessee. Now, if you break down the most recent DoD budget, there is a line item in there, I think it's roughly $3 billion, which plans to build a new one of these sites, but that's going to take 3 to 4 years. Tension between India and Pakistan seem pretty high right now.
Exactly. One of the things I sort of often find myself pointing out to people who work in sort of technology and finance is that defense is not like SaaS. You can't just, if you increase spending, it takes years for the effects of that to trickle through the system. Building like refiring up a factory that's been mothballed can take a very long time. Building new facilities will take a long time. So Germany is building these new manufacturing capabilities for ammunition and tanks, but deliveries from these new factories won't begin until the early 2030s at the very least. There is no such thing as a quick resupply, and there aren't parts you just pull off a shelf. A single artillery shell has to be manufactured, and yeah, both sides have firepower, but war isn't just about firing, it's about refiring, and both sides' abilities to keep doing that will depend entirely on global supply chains that they just don't control.
And one of the most, I guess, worrying parts of India-Pakistan relationship is what happens when ammunition runs out and one side has a tactical weapon that it can use against the other that the other cannot. That sounds bad for India and Pakistan. Alex, why should the rest of us care?
Because, I mean, for a start, we should care about the loss of life and human suffering, but approaching this through the lens of the dismal profession, a regional war in South Asia won't stay regional, especially when defense ecosystems are this globalized and this brittle. And then I think pretending we don't care about India and Pakistan for the moment, like when it comes to drones or artillery, like other countries are going to start noticing the effects, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, imagining a full-scale India-Pakistan conflict actually instantly vacuums up every available piece of global supply chain in the defense world that is under extreme duress at the minute because of existing wars in what feels like nearly every other region at the minute. Global stocks are already exhausted. So this war would not only eat up existing ammunition, but would eat years, potentially even decades into what we're not able to keep up with producing yet.
Yeah, it makes sense. If Ukraine needs sort of 10,000 plus drones a month to sustain its war effort, Israel is squeezing US reserves with its replenishment of its Harop and Hermes systems. You've seen Taiwan like panic buying quadrocopters and but by the crateful. So these pipelines are really in danger of fracturing. And when that happens, you'll see immediate price spikes across the supply chain, whether that's in electro optics, thermal imagers, lithium ion batteries, radios, carbon composites. And that's bad for defense ministries, especially in regions like Europe, which are already struggling to afford the cost of rearmament. But these obviously have kind of knock-on impact for civilian factories because these aren't often just military tools. Like these technologies are embedded in devices we use for all kinds of things. So we're already seeing this competition between the defense and consumer sector for raw materials. So
yeah, so what you're saying, Alex, is that we basically entered what defense economists would call the attrition paradox. So you spend billions of dollars on smart systems, but what actually determines battlefield tempo and cadence is who runs out of kind of the dumb steel first. And this is a big problem because cadence, and we talk about cadence a lot in trying to understand battlefield dynamics, cadence no longer relies on how good your AI is when you don't have enough bullets in the chamber.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's sort of interesting to see how the wheel turns. You know, militaries, many centuries, quite small forces, then they became very, very big through the 19th and into the 20th century, up into World War II and then through the Cold War. Then the fashion for kind of shrinking militaries, shrinking the stocks, moving towards sort of technology-enabled approaches to make warfare kind of smarter and cheaper became all of the rage. And this has just kind of stripped the resilience out of so many, especially Western militaries that kind of have embraced this doctrine. It's less the case in other parts of the world, but this problem goes deeper. I mean, if we just go back to India and Pakistan for a second, people obviously sort of know about sort of Taiwan for its capabilities in like manufacturing semiconductors, but India is one of the world's largest assemblers of semiconductors. So these companies aren't just domestic assets, they're embedded in global supply chains for telecoms, cars, aerospace, cloud servers.
Right. A war like this could essentially shut down entire sectors of the Indian industrial economy, right? Which effectively will hit Taiwan's fabs, Germany's car makers, and of course, UN's defense primes immediately. So it's not just that you lose access to radar chips and missiles that you never knew existed in the first place. You don't just lose the ability to maintain radar at all. If you're sitting there trying to buy a smartphone or trying to get your new iPhone, you're struggling.
Yeah, and Pakistan still provides logistical support corridors into Central Asia, overflight permissions, airbase access, covert ISR cooperations. As Islamabad flips fully into crisis mode, it does actually complicate life for Western governments, especially in crucial areas like anti-terror surveillance.
Short answer in this one. The real question, how many other countries would be forced to change strategy because of a South Asian war? And, you know, we've been thinking for so long about a different type of Asian war. This one, I don't think was on any immediate defense strategist's calendar.
And it's kind of wild when you think about the history that it wasn't. But in answer to your question, like it will affect everyone. So supply chains will collapse, prices will spike, insurance rates on cargo routes, which have already been having a pretty rough time with the Houthis launching rockets at any passing ship. The insurance rates on cargo routes near the Indian Ocean as well would skyrocket. Defense ministries will be rushing to grab every single, piece of hardware they can get their hands on. Think the kind of great COVID PPE panic of February/March 2020 being rerun over like optics components.
Yeah, this is nearly post-COVID supply chain all over again. This is not really a war on territory that we're going to be experiencing, although of course those in those territories will be. It's a war fought through customs declarations, boring stuff like container ships, semiconductor foundries. Most people outside of the realm of supply chain economics would ever think about, but one that even consumers in the US or Europe are going to feel.
So on that note, I need to head out to hoard as many semiconductors as I can get a hold of.
Exactly. That's it for this week. Thanks for tuning in to But This Time It's Different. While you're hoarding consumer electronics, I'm going to continue my armchair warlording, and we will be back next week. Bye.